Hello. So thank you for watching the video lecture for today. Today we're talking about energetics and metabolism. Now, unfortunately, I can't exactly lead discussion from a video lecture, so I'm going to try and cover the big questions that came up and bring up some ideas for you to think about. So when we talk about energetics and metabolism, I'm going to talk about what we're talking about here, and this comes at the base down to energy balance. So energy balance is the calories consumed versus the calories used. Energy in, energy out. Now, there's a lot of factors that make this more complicated. So the calories we consume are pretty straightforward, what we eat, but we don't all necessarily absorb exactly the same amount of energy from that. There's a lot of complicated factors that go into that, and we'll talk about some of that. But what we're talking about more today is energy used. And energy used involves three basic pieces: your resting calories, your activity, so your basic, as you're talking, as you're moving, I'm moving my hands, you're typing, as you're just sort of resettling yourself in your chair, right? All of those are activity. And we use some energy. And then there's exercise. If you go out and you're actively running or biking or lifting weights or playing soccer, anything, that's exercise. And at this really base level, if you consume fewer calories than you lose weight. If you consume more calories than you use, you gain weight. And that's true, but a lot of other factors can go in to the calories you actually get out of your food and the calories you actually use for your daily activities. And your body responds differently to things depending on whether it's fed or fasted. Now you're actually hearing from me. I'm recording this shortly after Yom Kippur because I wanted to get all your questions and have time to process them. So, I've just gone through a fast. For those of you who've gone through a fast, you will be familiar with sort of this experience. You have a very different experience when you're fasting. And your body is actually during a fast and now, triggering itself to use your energy stores to give yourself the energy you need. So those energy stores are glycogen and fat, and also your proteins, your muscles. Now, all of you have probably had the experience of not eating for long enough that your body starts triggering some of these things. Because this starts after about 6 hours without exercise. If you're not sleeping, sleeping reduces energy use. And if you're doing extreme exercise, can be much, much faster than that. So if you've ever been doing extreme exercise and had the experience of going into ketosis, that's one of the things we're talking about here. So fasting, we see glucagon causing the release of glucose into the bloodstream. So we're seeing gluconeogenesis. You're making glucose, and you're producing bile acids to be able to use those when you do eat. When you're fed, when you've eaten recently, instead you're producing insulin to cause your body to take up blood sugar. We'll talk more about that soon. You're not producing the bile acids. You're not producing new sugars. You've got bile acids actually circulating from the usage as they're being taken up with the food. So we're looking at a very different profile. And this goes into our regulation of metabolism. So our metabolism is regulated from insulin and glucagon. We're going to talk about this even more when we get to metabolic syndrome. But you're starting a case study on this on your own right now, looking at this. So looking at insulin and glucagon. Now, insulin is what causes our body to use the sugar that's circulating in your blood. So it sends signals to fat and to muscle cells to take up and use that sugar. Without that insulin, the sugar will just circulate in your blood And that's really important because your brain and your heart need glucose. So by signaling to your muscles and your fat cells and your liver, don't take up the glucose, we're sparing it for your brain and your heart, as long as there's not insulin. Now, glucagon is the other side of this. When your blood sugar gets low, your body releases glucagon. Glucagon sends signals to your liver to cause glycogen breakdown, to cause this gluconeogenesis, to circulate more blood sugar. And these two hormones working together in a healthy person keep your blood sugar balanced, keep it in homeostasis so that you always have enough blood sugar for your brain and your heart to function, but not enough blood sugar to cause problems for your cardiovascular system or your brain, which is what happens in diabetes, which we'll talk more about soon. Now, when we're talking about energy, we need to understand what happens with energy. Now, when your body uses energy, it is always going, that means your body is converting energy from one type of energy to another type of energy, from chemical energy to physical energy, or things like that. And when that happens, so energy can't be lost. You always have the same amount of energy around, but it can turn from high quality states, low entropy states, to low quality states, high entropy states. And if you want to get something from lower quality to higher quality, you're going to need to use a lot of waste. You're going to create a lot of waste energy. It's going to be released as heat. So whenever we do anything, this produces waste heat because we're converting energy from one type to another. And that conversion produces this waste heat, and that's what we can actually most easily measure. We're going to come back to this. And it all comes back to this catabolism and anabolism, where we're looking at these endergonic and exergonic reactions. So an endergonic reaction requires energy. And so it might be putting small molecules together to make large molecules. It might be active transport where you're moving something in or out of a cell movement. All of that requires energy. And there's exergonic reactions which release energy. So this includes catabolism, where you're cutting a large molecule into smaller pieces, includes cell respiration. And that produces energy that can be used to store ATP. And we can use ATP then to fuel these endergonic reactions. And this all goes through our energy cycle. And in this energy cycle, we have nutrients that we use for energy production, going through the metabolic cycles that we've talked about a little bit with the macronutrients. So goes through catabolism, where it's cut apart. We get ATP out. Some of that is stored into growth. Some of that goes into thermogenesis, into heat. Some of that goes into physical activity. So we're using all of this to produce the stuff that we need. Now we can measure energy use by measuring that waste heat that is being produced. And this is called direct calorimetry. So calorimetry, we're talking about calor, heat. Direct calorimetry measures the heat. We put a person in a chamber. We put in cold water surrounding the chamber, and then see how much that person in the chamber heats up the water going around it. So because heat is a byproduct of all exergonic reactions, as we saw with that entropy effect, that is going to allow us to measure the amount of energy that's being used in the as ATP is used for these reactions. Now we can also use indirect calorimetry. So direct calorimetry is measuring heat over here. Indirect calorimetry is measuring either oxygen or CO2. So to produce energy, we use oxygen and we produce CO2 as a waste product. So in indirect calorimetry, we're measuring one or the other of those. Now, one way to do this is by a respiration chamber, where an individual is in a respiration chamber, where they're in a place, and we're measuring exactly how much oxygen is going in, exactly how much oxygen and carbon dioxide are coming out. We can also do this with tubes hooked up so that you're not in a chamber, but it's measuring everything that's going in and out of your mouth and nose. Another way we can look at this is doubly labeled water. So doubly labeled water, we can label the hydrogen and the oxygen with heavy isotopes. And then we can track those heavy isotopes as they come out, seeing what's coming out in breathing, what's coming out in urine, what's coming out in feces, and what molecules those are actually coming out as. So is the oxygen coming out as carbon dioxide? Is the oxygen, coming out in water? What's going on with this as it processes through? And all of this allows us to measure metabolic rate. And metabolic rate is this total amount of energy used, so total metabolic rate. But we can also look at basal metabolic rate. So basal metabolic rate is the base amount of energy you use if you're awake, but not doing anything else. So if you're resting completely still, but awake. So we can see, so calories per hour for a 70-kilo man is 77 for that basal metabolic rate. Then, well, what if we add in other things? Well, just sitting actually adds substantially. So sitting is 100 rather than 77 for lying down, because if you think about it, you're using muscles just to hold yourself as you're sitting. And standing is a little more than that. And then we can talk about adding activities, non-exercise activities like dressing and undressing, typing. Then we can add, exercise things like swimming, running, walking upstairs. And all of those are going to have very different effects. And if we look at daily energy uses, this is a pretty common sort of range for the budget. About 60% is basal metabolic rate, about 8% is thermic effect from food. So just like the energy, the heat produced in breaking down your food. 7% is non-exercise activity. About 25% is purposeful physical activity, walking, running, biking. This is obviously going to vary drastically depending on whether you're a fairly sedentary person or whether you're an athlete, right? You're going to see a different impact here. We also can look at the metabolic rate. Now here we're looking specifically at that basal metabolic rate. So remember that basal metabolic rate that we're looking at, which is just no activity, but you're awake. Now the basal metabolic rate declines with age. We're looking at the basal metabolic rate by mass. So looking at the basal metabolic rate by age, and it's very high when you're young, goes down as you mature. That very steep change is just as the process of growing, and smaller animals have higher metabolic rates. When you get to adult size and you're done growing, you're fully mature, then we see a much slower drop off that continues happening throughout life. You'll see for females, you see a clear and distinct change right around menopause. For males, you still see the same decline, but it's a much more consistent, more gradual decline. Females are fairly stable between about 20 and perimenopause. Males have a much more gradual but consistent decline. All right, so then we're going to look at the research paper that we read for this. So this was looking at the energy use, the metabolic rates of people on a low-calorie diet. So this research was prompted by the observation that when we look at people who are placed on low-calorie diets and compare their expected weight loss with their actual weight loss, you see a big difference that people lose much less weight than they are expected to. Now, we also know people put back on weight, and obviously we know people don't follow these diets perfectly. And so there had always been, in most of this research, there was an assumption that most of the failure was people not following the diet. And here we were looking at, well, maybe that's not everything that's going on. Maybe this change in metabolic rate is also, there's also a change in metabolic rate that's having an impact. So for this, they recruited obese patients and did initial measurements, anthropometry measurements, where they're measuring the basic characteristics of the body, so body composition. They were also did a resting metabolic rate measurement, and they also did an exercise test to see how they did in that exercise condition. They also monitored compliance with the diet by monitoring urine acetoacetic acid concentration. I apologize if there's some little flubs. My brain is not completely recovered from fasting, so I have a lot of sympathy with these people right now. So this is actually looking at the degree to which your body is metabolizing its own fats, which you should be able to see from this diet. Right. So they measured resting metabolic rate using indirect calorimetry, using that gas chamber that we discussed earlier. And they had an intervention. They used a very low energy diet. So remember, expected energy is somewhere around 2,000 calories. It depends a lot per person, but for most people, a neutral diet is somewhere between about 1,600 and 2,500 calories per day. So this was, less than a third for most people of what their expected neutral diet would be. They also completed exercise training. So combining very low calorie diet with exercise should cause weight loss. And then they remeasured them during the 4th week of the diet, the 8th week of the diet, and 7 to 10 days after completion. And they measured their body composition, their resting metabolic rate, and they did this exercise test again. So looking at this resting metabolic rate and body composition. So here we're looking at 3 features on this chart. The fat-free mass, so the amount of body mass of everything except fat. So that's muscles and bones and your brain and your skin, everything except it's not fat. Then the black bar here is fat mass, so just the mass of the adipose tissue. And these triangles here are resting metabolic rates. So fat mass is over here with kilograms, resting metabolic rate over here with kilocalories per day. So if you look at baseline, so we see about 60 kilos of fat-free mass, 55 kilos of fat mass, and around a little under 75 kilocalories per day resting metabolic rate. By week 4, we do see a significant decline here in the fat mass. We also see a decline in the fat-free mass. So the mass of other tissues in the body, particularly usually muscle here, has also gone down. And we see a big decline in this resting metabolic rate. As I said, we did not see a significant difference from baseline in fat mass. Fat mass, significantly different baseline. by the 8th week, but not in the 4th week. My apologies, I misspoke. So we're seeing not a significant fat-free mass decline, although there's a trend, there might be. And then by week 8, we're seeing a significant fat mass decline. But right away, by week 4, we're seeing a significant decline in that resting metabolic rate that then stays low, even through this post-intervention. So resting metabolic rate has gone down from just under 75 to between 60 and 65. That's a pretty big drop that we're seeing. So these people are using less energy in their resting state. And if calculating that, looking at their energy deficit, if we look at their energy deficit with this change, with this actual change in resting metabolic rate, and when accounting for the change in fat-free mass, because of course fat-free mass is using energy, that brought our predictions much closer to the actual weight loss that we saw. So instead of the predicted weight loss being much lower, we're seeing it being much higher, that we expect them to lose much more weight than they did. Now we're seeing it's much closer to what we're actually seeing, explaining not all of the difference, and some of that was probably compliance, different changes in non-exercise activity rate, those sorts of things. But we're getting much better understanding of why this change is occurring. And some of it is because of this drop in resting metabolic rate. And if we look at the predicted versus actual weight loss, in the first month, it maps fairly closely to the predicted weight loss, but then in later months, it drops far below what was predicted. And a lot of that is because of this change in resting metabolic rate. And when we adjust our predictions for these things, so here they're adjusting for the resting metabolic rate, they're adjusting for the overall energy deficit, they're adjusting for the fat mass and fat-free mass. And when we do that, then we're seeing a much closer match of the actual weight loss to the predicted weight loss. So this metabolic baseline decline during this low diet and stayed low in post-intervention, and it accounted for 67% of the less than expected weight loss. Now, so that's the overall summary. I got some great questions from people that I really wish we could discuss as a group, but one was what happens on high energy diets. Now, this is interesting. If you place people on high energy diets in the short term, they do tend to make some of this up, especially with activity, but that slows down fairly rapidly. After a few weeks on the high energy diet, they tend to equilibrate, and this increase doesn't match, and your body much more easily goes up to a higher set point than it goes down to a lower set point. We also got a great question about what happens in other age groups, because this looked at a narrow range, and that's a great question. That's a great question for future research. All right, so that's what I have today. If I missed anything important from you, please reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions. And remember, there is the activity that's posted on Blackboard. Please go ahead and do that activity. And then I will see you in class next week. Thank you very much for watching.